The desert keeps its own kind of time, measured not by bells or battles, but by the long hush between the twin suns and the way wind braids the dunes into memory. And somewhere inside that hush, a man arrives with a name he sets aside, carrying a promise that must be kept with silence rather than swords. He chooses a ridge where stone holds the night's cool, and the horizon opens like a patient book, and he learns to breathe with the world instead of against it, each inhale smoothing the edges of a life cut ragged by fire. The galaxy has thundered and shuddered and fallen into the iron sleep of an empire. Yet here the only sound at dawn is the shy rattle of a moisture fan and the soft step of an Eope searching for shade. He has been a general and a teacher and a brother who failed to pull a friend back from the brink, and in the pieces of those names he finds a smaller one that fits the work ahead. Ben. Ben wakes before the light and drinks from a tin cup cool as starlight, and he watches the Lars homestead from a distance close enough to count footsteps and far enough to be no one at all. He studies weather like scripture, maps the safe paths between Dry Creek and Vaporator, and learns the grain of each rock on the overhang that looks down on a boy who does not know he is a hinge upon which tomorrow will turn. When fear stirs, he lets it pass through as a gust passes a doorway, touching nothing it can carry away. And when sorrow rises like heat, he bows his head and remembers to be grateful for the shade his cloak can give another. The old blade sleeps under folded cloth, and the force is practiced in small mercies. A calm given to a skittish pack animal, a canteen cooled by quiet attention, a scrap of metal nudged where it will jam a raider's rifle at the right moment and no sooner. He writes to a master he cannot see and waits for an answer that refuses to be hurried, learning that patience is not emptiness, but a vessel that holds a brighter water. At night, he names constellations that were once coordinates on wartime charts, now simple lanterns that keep him company, and he gives each year a title the way a monk might title a psalm. The year of wind, the year of hard rain, the year the boy laughed at sunrise. In this manner, the heart that would not stop aching begins to loosen like a knot under warm hands. The desert does not forgive or forget, but it teaches, and he is willing to be taught. In that willing, a quiet takes root, and in that quiet, a vow. If the galaxy must sleep through a long dark, then let there be one small light that does not go out, a light watched from a ridge by a man who once shouted across the stars and now chooses to listen. The fire does not end when the flames go out. It follows him into the ship, into the cramped silence between alarms, into the way his hands steady because they must and not because they are calm. He does not look back at the world of black glass and orange sky. He will carry that world in the smell of burned cloth and in the taste of metal at the back of his throat for as long as he has breath. Now there is only the infant wrapped against his chest and the task that is larger than grief. The child sleeps through the shaking. He keeps one palm over that tiny weight to feel the rise and fall, a quiet that proves the future has not been erased. The stars streak and settle. Coordinates are entered with old reflex, but the motion feels different now. Not the movement of a commander returning to base, but the slow turning of a door into a single room he has chosen and cannot leave until his watch is done. The journey lasts long enough for the ache in his bones to become just another rhythm, long enough for the things he will not say to crowd the cockpit like unwelcome guests he cannot not ask to leave. He murmurs practical words to the child that double as prayer. He tells him that the air is clean, that the water is good, that beyond the first door there will be kind hands, and beyond the second door there will be the horizon, and that the horizon is a friend if you learn its language. He tells him that his name is Luke, and that this name will not be spoken often near loud places, that it will be saved for kitchens and doorways and soft cloth folded by patient hands. He tells him nothing of lightsabers or temples or brothers lost at the edge of a river of fire. He tells him that he is loved. And in saying it, he gathers the scattered pieces of himself into a shape that can walk. Tatooine appears as a pale coin held up to the black. He has been here before as a younger man with clearer eyes, a place that taught him how to barter and how to wait, a place that kept secrets under dunes. The ship descends through thin cloud and wind that smells of dust and sun. He does not risk walled spaceports where Imperial cursors blink on consoles, and curious clerks ask for papers that he does not intend to provide. He chooses a barren stretch beyond a ridge he remembers, a shelf of stone that hides the hull from any routine patrol. The landing skids scrape, settle, sigh. The child stirs. He sets the ramp and feels the heat reach up to greet him like an old acquaintance who knows the rules. He tightens the scarf around his throat and steps down into the sand. Owen Lars does not flinch when he sees him, and that the horizon is a friend if you learn its language. He tells him that his name is Luke, and that this name will not be spoken often near loud places, that it will be saved for kitchens and doorways and soft cloth folded by patient hands. He tells him nothing of lightsabers or temples or brothers lost at the edge of a river of fire. He tells him that he is loved. And in saying it, he gathers the scattered pieces of himself into a shape that can walk. Tatooine appears as a pale coin held up to the black. He has been here before as a younger man with clearer eyes, a place that taught him how to barter and how to wait, a place that kept secrets under dunes. They speak of water levels and evaporator repairs and the times of market day and when the off-world buyers come and go. They speak as farmers do, in the language of the immediate, because naming small things and tending them is how you make room for larger vows. He sleeps that first night, not far from the homestead, a little way up the low ridge where the wind sings around the rock. The stars are familiar and strange in the way all stars are, and he lets their pattern enter him like breath. When he closes his eyes, he sees a river of flame and a face half shadowed by love and anger, and he does not argue with the memory or force it to be quiet. He sets it down beside him like a heavy tool that has done its work and will be picked up only when needed. Sleep comes irregularly, in shallow cups that fill and spill, but it comes. When dawn grays the sky, he is already seated with his legs folded, hands open on his knees, the cup of water cooling under the gentle pressure of attention. He drinks and feels the calm settle not as triumph, but as a decision that will need to be made again each morning. The first day of his new life begins with counting steps. He traces a circle from ridge to slope, from slope to shallow gully, from gully to a scatter of rock that holds a view of the homestead without inviting a watcher's silhouette. He marks places where shadows are long at noon, where algae clings to a damp seam in stone, where a dewback has worn a path that could hide a man if the man learns to move as slowly as an animal trusts. He times the burble and cough of moisture fans until the sound becomes a clock written in air. Each detail is another strand in a net he will weave around the child's days, a net so wide and soft no one will feel it until they try to harm what it guards. By midday he meets the heat as one meets an old teacher who does not soften the lesson. He keeps his head covered and his frame narrow against the light. His clothes are not those of a Jedi now. He has traded the cut of tradition for cloth that loses itself against stone. A Jawa sandcrawler chuffs along a distant line, its slow confidence like a moving hill. He notes its route and the times it pauses, and the billow of sand that means barter is happening out of sight. There will be a day to meet them, to acquire a few parts, to begin the small commerce that makes a man look like he belongs. Not today. Today he learns the names of the rocks and the direction of the smallest wind dot. In the afternoon he finds the cave that will be his first shelter. Its mouth welcomes sunrise and turns away from the harshest sun. Inside there is a ledge that will hold a bedroll and a hollow where a kettle can sit without smoke betraying his presence. He places his pack down and feels the ground answer with a steadiness that is not comfort exactly, but something close. From the cave he can see the Lars homestead as a rectangle of purpose cut into the land. He watches as Owen checks the arrays, as Beru carries water, as a woman from a neighboring plot arrives and leaves with a basket and a laugh. He lets the scene rest on his eyes like a cool cloth. A pattern begins to form, a rhythm he can match without ever stepping into their light dot. At dusk, he does intervene once, but not with a blade. Two figures pause at the edge of a low ridge beyond the farm. Strangers by their stance and the way they measure with their chins. He notes the path they would take to approach under cover and the blind angle near a ventilation shaft that a clever raider might use. He waits until their attention turns to an argument about something small. With a thought as gentle as moving a bead across a string, he urges a loose sheet of sand to slide just enough to reveal their footprints, a warning to anyone watching from the homestead that something is not quite right. He places a misplaced glint on a rock to catch a wary eye. The figures confer, uncertain now that luck seems unfriendly. They turn away. No one will know why. That is how he intends to keep it. When night comes full, he unwraps a cloth packet and holds what is inside without removing it. The weight is known to his hand as intimately as his own heartbeat. He does not need to look at its silver length to remember the hum, the light, the way it has resolved arguments that words could not. He wraps it again and sets it beneath the second layer of his pack. The other saber, the one that belonged to a man he loved, is sealed deeper away where the mind does not reach by accident. He does not plan to draw either, unless the small circle of this world is in mortal danger. He repeats this plan quietly until it becomes a shape in his mind, more solid than the blade itself. Before sleep, he writes a few lines on a scrap that will become the first page of a long, private ledger. He does not know if anyone will ever read it. He addresses it to a teacher whose voice he has not heard since the temple burned, and the corridors filled with the sound of running feet. He does not ask for signs or wonders. He writes the day plainly. He writes that the child has arrived safely and that the guardians are strong. He writes that he is afraid and that he will not let fear be the hand that guides his steps. He writes that he will wait for whatever answer takes the form of tomorrow's light. The night wind carries the smell of cold stone and dry sage. Far off, a bantha groans, patient as a mountain that learned to walk. In the homestead, a small sound rises and falls, the noise a child makes when dreams turn a little. He listens, not with the old sharpness that leaps to intervene, but with the new attentiveness that honors another family's strength. The sound settles. He lets his breath find the same cadence. The fire has followed him to this place, but it is banked now, contained within a purpose that does not roar or devour. In that containment there is a different kind of heat, the warmth a lamp gives when set in a window, not to warn ships off rocks, but to tell a traveler that a door waits and that the night can be crossed. He knew the old name would draw eyes. Names travel faster than feet in a place like Tatooine, carried in gossip and traded like spare parts. So he practiced a smaller sound in his mouth, a word that would not echo across rooms or wake the instincts in soldiers trained to listen for it. He tried it while boiling water and while tightening a strap on the Eope and while tracing a new path down the ridge. Ben. It felt like a pebble held in the hand, useful, unremarkable, ready to be set down anywhere. He taught himself to answer to it with a nod that did not invite questions and to speak it softly in markets where loud vowels drew attention. The old name remained bundled away with the saber, a thing that would only see light if the sky itself tore dot. The first day he used it in town began with sand still cool underfoot. Mos Eisley looked as it always had to a careful eye, which is to say it looked different in 100 small ways. New insignia stamped on a checkpoint post, a fresh dent in a cantina door, a shopkeeper whose smile no longer reached both eyes. He moved as a man who hoped to leave with the same number of coins he brought, shoulders angled to slip past talk. At the Jawa stall, he offered a coil of wire for a dented tool and a joke. Tika laughed and pretended she was offended at the idea of trading a story for metal. He asked for nothing more than to be remembered as the quiet one who paid on time and carried his own purchases. She called him Ben without being told. Perhaps the name had already found him. Cloth came next. He traded a sliver of a power cell and some scavenged screws for 2 rough robes that did not hang like temple patterns. The cut was meant for heat and wind, not for ceremony. He stood beneath a canvas awning while the tailor eyed him and folded fabric with that particular care the desert teaches. The tailor's questions were practical. Where would he walk? How long would he be gone at a time? How much sun would he accept before seeking shade? Ben answered like a man who had listened to stone more than to voices. When the robes were done, they carried a shape that could become part of any wall or crowd. He thanked the tailor with more sincerity than the man expected and felt the first small click of a cover identity sliding into place. He found a place in Mos Eisley where parts changed hands with fewer words. There he learned the prices that marked a newcomer from a fool and the prices that marked an old hand from a thief. He never pressed until a line snapped. He used silence as bargaining more than once and learned that the best currency in a port town is predictability. When he did speak, he asked after weather and routes and which patrols had been thick last week and thin today. People talk when they think a man is only keeping himself alive. He nodded, slipped away, and wrote down those rotations in his mind where they would become another layer of quiet protection for the farm on the horizon. Practice kept him smaller. He changed his walk, letting the heel kiss the ground without stamping a claim. He placed his hands where no one could mistake them for someone about to reach inside a robe for the wrong thing. He taught his gaze to drift past faces and land on useful details. A sliver of paint on a crate meant it had been seized before and returned. The way a trooper's gloves creased meant long hours in heat, the sort of fatigue that makes eyes dull. The dullness of eyes meant a better chance of passing by unnoticed than a day when boredom made a man curious. He let the Force be a cool thread through all of it, and kept it trimmed to quiet uses that did not ripple beyond his body. A measured breath, a balance adjusted, a slip of intent that made another glance away at the right second dot. The first test of the name came when a mechanic waved him over to help lift a panel while two troopers waited for work on a speeder. The mechanic needed muscle more than he needed questions. Ben stepped in, bent, and lifted. One trooper grunted and asked for a name with the sloppy authority of someone who never expected a wrong answer. Ben gave it and did not let it rise as a challenge. The trooper made a mark on a slate. Nothing else happened. The panel went back on. The mechanic nodded thanks with his chin. Ben walked away with the understanding that anonymity also requires the willingness to be useful at the right moment. It took discipline to keep the old edges from showing. Politeness had been a habit in the old life, but here too much courtesy read as a tell. He allowed himself to be brusque when a moment called for it and learned which merchants appreciated a quick decision more than a smooth word. He did not hold doors in places where doorways were currency. He did share water once with a traveler whose canteen had cracked, and he did it with the flat matter of a local, not the shining compassion of a legend. Every kindness was measured to the scale of the mask, because the mask served a child and a future, not a story about a man who once won arguments with a blade dot. He returned to the cave after those first days in town with a pouch that held more than parts. It held a tested version of himself that fit the lines of the land. He set his new robes on a flat rock and pressed the seams smooth. He poured tea that tasted a little like the metal it boiled in, and let the evening unwind his careful posture inch by inch. He repeated the name under his breath once more and listened to how it sat inside his chest. Ben would be the man who bought spare filters and never asked for credit. Ben would be the man who walked home before dusk and avoided arguments he could not win with silence. Ben would be the man seen once a week by Tika and twice a month by the tailor, and not at all by the people who would prefer to spot the ghost of a general, where they could make a report. He wrote one line that night in his ledger to the teacher whose answers came as mornings. He wrote that the new name had been used and had held. He wrote that it felt like bending a branch without breaking it. He wrote that a life can be made from small, repeated choices in the right direction. Then he closed his eyes and let the desert breathe through him. Somewhere below, the homestead lantern went out. Somewhere above, a star he had known since boyhood held its place. The old name waited in the dark like a river under rock, real and strong, but the surface flowed gently, and for now that was enough. From the ridge he learned the homestead's hours the way a musician learns a lullaby. At first he only measured sounds: the moan of a moisture fan at dawn, the soft clank of Beru's bucket at the cistern, Owen's boots cutting a rhythm along the same track between panels and workshop. Then he began to count light, how the early glare slid along the dome, how the shadow under the vaporator arms crawled a handspan each hour until the day itself felt mapped, and he could sit with hands folded and know where everyone was without seeing them. He set 3 vantage points: the east notch for mornings, the broken column for middays when mirage shook the air, and the low lip of stone where dusk pooled. From each he watched without taking. He told himself this posture was not distance, but gentleness, The kind that guards without insisting it is the reason anyone is safe. He chose a circuit that never left the same prince twice. Some days he moved counterclockwise, some days in mirrored steps. When wind erased everything, he smiled. A partner doing its part. He tested how long he could sit without the force reaching ahead of his attention, and he learned that patience sharpened rather than dulled his senses. The land offered small lessons as payment. A line of ants scissored to a seam in the rock where a dampness clung after night. He remembered the place and later tucked a stoppered gourd there for a traveler who would never know why thirst broke. A dewback bull dragged its tail across his path and left a trench shallow enough to hide a footfall. He returned at dusk and smudged it closed, saving a future trooper the pleasure of reading tracks. Each tiny choice felt like threading a bead onto a cord that circled the farm without tightening. Sometimes the ridge asked him to act. A scrap of slate broke free above the north slope and rattled down toward a rattling tool Owen had left on a ledge. With a nudge no heavier than a thought, he tipped the stone sideways so it kissed the sand instead of the tool and made no noise to bring curious eyes. A thirsty womp rat nosed near a cable and might have chewed through it. He tossed a rind from his own meal far enough to draw the creature aside. The help was always small, always deniable even to himself, the way a breeze moves a curtain that might have moved on its own. He promised the ridge he would not break its quiet with a blade unless the night itself tore, and the ridge kept his promise by giving him places to sit that saw everything. He did not always find calm there. Some afternoons the heat swelled with memory, and Mustafa rose in the air like a bad mirage. When that happened, he opened his journal and wrote the exact weather into it. Horizon pale, thin wind, a far-off rumble of crawler treads, until the present grew heavier than the past. He wrote a few lines to the teacher, whose voice still hid in sunlight. Lines like prayer, but plainer. What do I do when the urge to fix the world claws at me? The answer was usually the same. Watch the boy. So he did. He learned Luke's laugh before he ever saw Luke's face, a laughing like a cork popping on a canteen, sudden and bright. He learned the cadence of Beru's scolding and the way Owen's silence sometimes softened at the edges when the child held a toy ship high and made it bang. Once, a sandstorm came in mean and quick. He felt the shape of it turn like a wild bantha and head straight for the farm. He could have stood on the ridge and held the air in place with both hands. Instead, he ran low along the slope and triggered at 3 different points, small slides he had prepared for no reason he could explain when he made them. The slides stole the storm's edge, split it, bent it around the homestead, enough that inside they would blink and call it a near miss, the kind that fills a house with dust and stories but does no harm. He lay flat until grit stopped biting his cheeks, then rose and brushed himself clean and felt something uncoil in his chest. Protection could be a whisper. It could also be 3 piles of stones pushed at the right moment by a man who had learned to wait for the right moment. On the nights when quiet sounded too loud, he walked the long way back to his cave and let the sky talk. He named a track of stars for the temple's old south corridor, not because he wanted to go back, but because the memory of it still contained corridors of laughter and late lessons and tea. He followed a meteor across half the vault and told himself it was a message delivered. Everything breaks in light, and everything continues. Near the cave mouth, he paused and looked once more toward the farm. A dim lamp, a smaller, moving flicker that could only be someone rocking a child. He did nothing. He allowed himself the luxury of doing nothing. Watching from the ridge had taught him the scale of help that truly served. And tonight, help looked like staying where the stone held cool, and the horizon kept its patient line, ready to notice if tomorrow tilted. Morning began before color returned to the dunes, a pale hush where the air felt like cool cloth laid across a fevered brow, and in that hush he practiced the first lesson he could trust again. Stay still. He sat cross-legged on the cave's smooth ledge, hands resting on his knees, and counted breaths until the old habits that had once sharpened him into a blade softened into something quieter. The Force met him there, not as a current to be ridden into combat, but as a wide, shallow lake that reflected anything placed above it. He set his thoughts down one by one like stones, and watched the ripples fade. The saber remained wrapped beside his bedroll. His discipline now was to keep it where it belonged, a last answer to a last question, instead of a key to unlock every door. He cooled his canteen with a thought no larger than a sigh, and sipped slowly, letting gratitude fold into his ribs where anxiety had once lived. The day's plan took shape with the modest ambition of a farmer. Check the ridge, test the wind, listen for trouble, ignore most of it. Routines grew teeth only if he neglected them. So he gave each task the attention it deserved. He checked the lines he had run near the ridge, little threads of warning tucked between rocks that would flutter and gather dust differently if trooper boots paced over them. He replaced a frayed cord with a better knot and used his thumbnail to lift a burr from a boot sole so his tread would not sing against stone. He mapped the morning's shadows and set 2 pebbles at a crack to mark how far the sun climbed by midday. All of it small. All of it the opposite of glory. His discipline was restraint measured in pebbles, cord, and silent T-dot. The first test of that restraint came in Mos Eisley when an argument snapped into a fight outside a supply stall. A freighter hand put a shoulder into a Weequay who had cut the line, and the Weequay turned with a grin that promised bad news. The crowd drew tight the way crowds do when they want to see and not be seen. Ben was close enough to smell the sour heat of engine grease on the freighter hand's sleeves, close enough that a single gesture could have loosened every clenched jaw and put a nap over the scene like a soft blanket. His palm twitched. He remembered younglings laughing at a lesson about how easy it is to help and how hard it is to help well. He let his hand fall. The stall keeper, who had spent 3 decades turning arguments into sales, raised the price of water and lowered the price of tubing, and the Weequay's interest in the fight evaporated under a better bargain. Ben bought nothing, said nothing, and learned again that saving a man from himself is rarely the same thing as saving him. Discipline meant not reaching for proof that he still could. He had been a general whose reflex was to intervene, to solve in front of witnesses so that morale rose with the solution. Now his only audience was the desert and the ledger he kept for a master who remained politely silent. Each evening he wrote a few plain lines. Today the wind changed, and I stood with it. Today a boy outpaced his shadow at noon and fell laughing in the dust. Today I did not make the smallest effort feel like a victory. He did not ask for forgiveness in those pages because asking assumes a debt. He asked for steadiness, which assumes a path. He allowed himself small uses of the Force that trained humility more than power. He steadied his Eopie with a murmur when a gust made the animal skitter. He coaxed a cracked clay cup to hold together for one more day, rather than replacing it with something new, preferring repair to novelty. He cooled the floor of the cave at dusk, so sleep would come easily and wakefulness would arrive honest. He kept his presence collapsed like a fold of cloth, a trick learned in wartime but now employed for peace. If a patrol passed within 20 paces, they felt nothing more unusual than the edge of their own boredom. Midway through one long afternoon, a pair of swoops kicked dust along a track that led past the Lars homestead toward a depot. The riders were young and noisy, and the sort of dangerous that comes from wanting to be seen. He let them pass without a thought in their direction. Minutes later, another sound hummed from behind the ridge, a disciplined engine note that did not belong to boys playing at Menace. He felt the tilt inside himself, the tightness that still called interference a virtue. He counted 7 breaths, just long enough to separate instinct from duty, and then angled his steps toward a vantage point that would show him the depot yard. When the second pair of riders dismounted, he saw the stripes on their sleeves and the empty look of men sent to catch trouble as a lesson to others. The younger riders barreled into the yard and found a conversation waiting they could not win. He watched long enough to know the depot boss had already cut a deal that would trade credits for bruised egos and send everyone home more careful. He turned away. Not his moment, not his cost to escalate. In town. That week he bought a length of hose and 2 filters and left the better of the filters in a crate, where Beru would find it folded under a bolt of cloth she was bound to buy. He left no mark, wrote no note, and practiced an unfamiliar discipline on the way back to the cave. He did not picture her surprise, did not build a story in which he was thanked in secret. He simply let the act sink into the same quiet that held pebbles and knots. Discipline was not only the habit of not doing, but the habit of doing without needing to be known for it. At dusk, he returned to the lip of the stone where the day yawned into blue shadow and let his breath match the earth again. Far off, a Tuscan flute stitched a melody over the ridge, and he welcomed it the way one welcomes a neighbor's lantern flickering to life. Neither invitation nor threat, only proof that other lives keep their own time. He placed his wrapped saber on the stone beside him and rested his palm on it the way one rests a hand on a sleeping hound, not to wake it, only to remind it that it is loved and that today it was not needed. He counted a final set of breaths, rose, and carried the quiet with him into the cave, where sleep met him as a partner rather than a prize. Discipline had been a word for battle once. Here it became a way to make more room for the morning. He learned the Tuscan routes before he learned every star in the local sky, not the caricatures traded in cantinas, but the braided paths real feet made, banthas favoring softer ground, scouts skirting the highest glare, family columns pausing where stones lifted a little breeze. At first he watched from far enough that the sound came to him as weather, low calls that seemed to grow out of the dunes, a drum of hooves that never hurried. Then he began to read what they left behind. A circle of small stones near a dry wash meant "do not drink here." A spiral etched by a Gaddafi meant "we mourned." 2 crossed lines where the sand would swallow them by noon meant "turn back." He wrote none of it in the ledger. Some lessons should stay in the hands that share them. Instead, he kept the meanings in his body, letting his own roots bend like reeds around theirs. When he first met a scout's gaze, it was not a meeting at all. He had come over a saddle of rock at dawn, expecting the usual emptiness, and found a figure already there, wrapped against the light, still as a cairn. The Eope froze. The Tuscan did not move. They regarded each other without threat for the span of a long breath. He lowered his chin, Not submission, not challenge, only the desert's version of, "I hear you." The scout tilted the head a fraction, enough to say, "We see you," without saying, "We will remember you later," in anger. He turned his mount slowly and made a wide curve that left their hidden camp undisturbed. It was not friendship, but it was not shadow hate either. That night, a flute rose across the ridge with a melody that did not ask for translation. He listened, and something in his chest answered, the way water answers a stone dot. He began leaving small offerings at places where paths crossed. A strip of cloth tied to a thorn, a sealed vial of clean water nested under a shard of sun-baked pottery, a smooth bead set inside the curve of a crate bone. He chose items that said human hands were here, but not Jedi. The first few vanished. A week later, one came back, a different bead carved with a line that made his thumb remember the shape of wind. That was how trust took root. Not with handshakes or names, but with a slow exchange of things too humble to steal and too practical to scorn. When moisture farmers spoke in town of raids, he remembered the bead and said nothing. He mended a rumor's torn edge by asking how water had been stored and whether a certain fence line had been moved, nudging a conversation toward the quiet truth that encroachment and need often look like the same act from far away. Once, tracks told him of a hunt that would intersect with Owen's outer cistern. He found the place at dusk where two worlds might scrape and bled the tension into the sand. He loosened a valve just enough to make the pipe hum oddly and hung a rag on a bolt to suggest a recent repair. He left a line of his own prints walking deliberately away from the cistern toward a nearer, smaller seep he had uncovered the week before with his hands and a flat stone. At dawn, the Tuscan line followed the prints and chose the seep. Later, he returned and firmed the valve, wiped the bolt clean, smoothed his tracks with a branch. No one thanked him. No one should. The lesson was not stop them, but lead thirst where it will not make enemies. He learned the rhythm of their seasons, when the banthas calved, and the air around their camps smelled faintly of milk and smoke, when morning songs carried farther because the air was cold and thin, when the young practiced with Gaderfi in lines that moved like reeds in crosswind. He never intruded. He never played the expert. On rare mornings he drew a sign in the sand, where only a high ridge would see it, a simple arc that said "Storm from the East." Twice, days later, he found a new sign next to his own, an echo or a correction, a double arc meaning, and from the south on its heels. In this way, a map grew between strangers, a map written only in places wind erases dot. Disagreements still visited the dunes. He watched a moisture farmer fire warning shots too close to a Tuscan scout and felt the recoil of old stories drawing breath. He did not step between. He could have. He could have turned the farmer's fear into calm and the scout's pride into caution. Instead, he walked the farmer's fence line at night and shifted 3 stakes back to where they had been last season, where the agreed distance lay. He left a scrap of the farmer's own cloth tied to the right post, familiar, undeniable. He did the same on the Tuscan side, smoothing the footprint of a youth who had crossed out of habit rather than intent. The next day, both parties found what they had lost. A line they could call theirs without needing to spill anyone's water to defend it. Not more than once he saw the aftermath of a skirmish not of their making. Blast a scorch on rock, where off-worlders had tried to test themselves against a people they did not wish to understand. He buried a body when he had to, saying no words, and he carried a foundling vaporator plate halfway across a basin. because someone would need it, and need is a language older than flags. When Tusken voices carried grief along the ridge, he stood in his cave mouth and let the wind bring the notes as they were. No translation, no fixing, only recognition that mourning and survival are neighbors who visit each other often. He never learned their names, and they never learned his. The ledger kept no tally of favors. Trust, when it appears in a hard land, is not a contract, but a weather pattern. It is the season when storms split around the farm, and the year when a flute plays longer on clear nights. He came to understand that calling them sand people in town was like calling the stars points. Not wrong, but lazy. They were a nation that moved, a history written in footfalls, an archive of thirst and answer. And they were not shadows. It was the rest of the galaxy that had gone dim. On a day when the twin suns burned gentler than usual, he paused on the ridge and raised his palm toward a line of riders passing in the middle distance. One hand lifted in reply, a greeting small enough not to need witnesses, large enough to hold. He learned quickly that if the dunes kept the planet's memories, the Jawas indexed them. Tika's sandcrawler moved like a patient mountain, groaning along routes that had existed since before maps. And if you wanted to know which patrols were lazy this month, which vaporators sang off-key, which moisture farmer had started buying more filters than their allotment excused, you did not ask a trooper or a clerk. You asked Tika while pretending to haggle over a bolt that would never quite fit anything. Information was the true currency. Parts only kept it flowing. Ben made himself the sort of customer a Jawa respects. Punctual, unflappable, appreciative of ingenuity, and never offended when a price tripled only to fall to half with a theatrical sigh. He brought offerings that weren't credits. A cloth bundle of properly sorted screws, a salvaged lens polished to clarity, a story about a storm's eddies that might save a sandcrawler a day of digging. Tika, for her part, traded him the knowing that keeps a watcher ahead of trouble. He learned the sandcrawler's voice in pieces, the forward tread's complaint when grit chewed their teeth, the happier clunk after someone he'd never meet oiled a stubborn housing, the celebratory honk when a rare find was winched aboard. He would hear it in the distance and adjust his path, not to intercept, but to place himself where a conversation might happen as if by accident. Tika liked customers who understood that business happens where it is convenient for the sandcrawler, not the other way around. She would lean out of a hatch with orange eyes bright and call him Ben who pays on time, and he would lift a hand in greeting and admire the latest antenna welded from 3 different lives. Their talk began with jokes and ended with small truths. She'd mention a new Black Armor parade on the Mos Eisley South Road and how its rhythm had already slowed. Bored men grow careless. Careful men grow predictable. He'd trade a nearly new gasket and receive, in return, a casual aside that someone had asked after mystics in the market and left without buying anything, which meant they had come to buy the rumor itself. Inside the sandcrawler's belly, he moved as if in a cathedral built from other cathedrals, aisles of half-remembered machines, shelves of languages spoken by metal. The Jawa's genius was not merely in scavenging, but in listening to what a thing still wanted to be. A broken datapad became a moisture meter. A storm-shattered panel became shade for a transmitter that overheated every day at noon. Ben learned to ask for function, not for form. "I need something that can hold a trickle of current without singing to itself," he'd say, and Tika would vanish into a thicket of inventory, returning with an impossible solution, a bundle that looked like refuse until it breathed in his hands and did exactly what he had hoped. He paid fairly, and when the price strained fairness past the point of humor, he smiled and added an extra filter to the pile. Because relationships do not balance on a single scale. They hang on many. Gossip glittered in that metal dusk. He never asked a direct question about the Law's homestead. He learned the shape of news as it avoided saying names. A farm east of the third dune line had a visitor last week, Tika would murmur, and he would reply that the wind had been from the north, so visitors with long coats would have sand in their boots for days. A depot foreman asked if anyone had seen old Republic sigils in scrap, she might add, and he would observe that such a foreman must be bored, which is a dangerous state for a man who orders other men. They built a language where caution felt like wit. In this way, he knew when off-world buyers with cruel tempers docked at the port, and when a small herd of banthas took a new route that would keep them well west of the farm for a season. He repaired more than he bought. Tika liked to see what he could coax from a tired part, with nothing but attention and a patience that refused to turn effort into spectacle. He'd sit on the sand with a component in his lap while Jawas clustered to watch him strip, clean, and resolder with the gentleness of someone mending a favorite cup. He spoke to the pieces in low tones, nonsense syllables, old lullabies from barracks and starships, and sometimes he let the force settle into the weld just enough to make metal remember coherence. When the part hummed evenly, the Jawas clicked approval and traded him an extra length of tubing as if the desert itself had paid a bonus. Tika teased that he was stealing her apprentices by teaching them to love the fix more than the sale. He replied that a good fix sells itself twice, once to the buyer and again to the buyer's neighbor. Once, the sandcrawler limped into a basin with an ugly shudder that sang of imminent failure. He had been following a ridge, and the sound cut across the wind like a plea. He found a place to descend and arrived as the crew argued under their breath about risk and route. The next climb would break something that could not be replaced this side of Anchorhead. He asked permission with a tilt of his head, climbed beneath the chassis, and felt with his fingertips for heat and friction. A rock shard had wedged where no rock had any right to be. He did not lift it with the force. He used a pry and a patient wedge he made from a scrap, and when it came free, the entire vehicle sighed like a creature relieved. Tika named a price too low for the part he wanted next. He paid her extra anyway. Mutual respect is a ledger with no numbers. The Jawas told him when to be seen and when to be elsewhere. "Not today for the market," Tika would chirp, quoting a rumor about a surprise inspection. "Tomorrow bring smaller coins." He avoided the inspection, and the next day he brought smaller coins. In return, he mentioned, as if in passing, that the Western Flats carried the faint tone of a storm 3 days off, the kind that fools only a week's worth of fools. She relayed it up and down the trader's chain, and a half-dozen farmers moved their repairs 1 day earlier, saving themselves grief and saving her inventory from demands she could not meet on short notice. No one would ever toast to such a chain of events. That was why it worked. He kept the relationship small on purpose. A favor asked is a debt owed. A rhythm kept is a friendship that requires nothing to prove itself. He never climbed past the second rung in the sandcrawler. He never tried to see the private shrine where Jawas keep the pieces that mean more than parts. He left a satchel once with a tidy assortment of screws by size, each wrapped and labeled in basic and in the simple glyphs he'd learned from Tika's casual doodles. "For the ones who are learning," he said. She clicked a laugh and called him a fool, which in Jawa talk is near to a compliment, then pushed a wrapped bundle into his hands. A tool that turned out to be a child's toy, 2 gears that turned each other forever. He set it on his cave shelf where he kept only 3 things: water, the ledger, and reminders that Hope likes to move. When talk in town turned mean about thieves in brown hoods, he let it pass. He knew better. The Jawas were archivists of need, ferrying the planet's half-answers until someone could make them whole. And they knew everything worth knowing, not because they spied, but because they listened while other people complained. In a noisy galaxy, the ones who listen are the ones who keep you safe. He stepped out of the crawler's shadow with new filters, a coil of wire shaped like tomorrow, and 2 rumors tucked under his tongue like seeds. Back on the ridge, he planted those seeds where only he could see them, and he watered them with patience. The sandcrawler's voice dwindled into distance. The farm's steady rhythm took its place. Between them, a watcher named Ben kept the quiet stitched. The years did not arrive as milestones. They arrived as habits that settled into place and called themselves ordinary. He learned to measure time by the names he gave each turn of weather. The year of long wind, when grit found its way into every seam, making even laughter sound sandy. The year of singing vaporators, when a rare humidity kept fans purring like contented creatures. The year of too many stars, when cold nights sharpened the sky until it seemed you could pluck constellations down by hand. In those long, dry spans, he built a life sized to fit between danger and dawn. Mornings belonged to the ridge and to quiet circuits that changed just enough to leave no pattern. Midday belonged to maintenance, stitching sandals, oiling leather, filing burrs from tools until they shone with a modest pride of usefulness. Evenings belonged to the ledger and to the slow untying of thoughts that wanted to race ahead of their day. Sleep, which had once been a battlefield, became a companion that waited for him at the cave mouth. Patient as stone, Luke grew in measurements that surprised him. First, by the height of a vaporator arm, when the boy reached to hang a rag and missed by a handspan less than last month. Then by the size of the footprints tracked between domes, toes pressing deeper, strides stretching a fraction farther. Then by the sound of chores done faster, a tin pail set down with a confidence that said a task had moved from learned ed to known. Ben watched these markers the way a gardener watches a landscape he cannot touch, trusting sun and water to do what sun and water have always done, stepping in only to nudge a shadow or shelter a sprout without claiming the harvest. Twice a year, when trade brought more mouths into Mos Eisley and gossip swelled like a spring tide, he thinned his visits, content to let Tika's sandcrawler pass without flagging it, content to drink the tea he had and count the days by the cool weight of the cup in his hands. Grief did not vanish. It diluted. In the early years it came like a squall, hot and blinding, and left him shaky. Later it arrived like distant thunder, a reminder that storms existed, but were not, at this moment, on his ridge. He gave it space when it visited, the way one sets an extra bowl at a table for a traveler. He did not rehearse old arguments with the past, or stage a courtroom in his head where verdicts could be rendered at last. He wrote the weather, he wrote the day, he wrote a small detail that belonged to no tragedy at all. The way a lizard blinked, the way a torn sleeve felt mended under his fingers, and in that practice The ache spread thin, wide as the desert, and lost its edge. The long dry years taught his body new economies. He spoke less and heard more. He moved in shade without looking for it. He learned where a single sip would become a swallow and where it should not. He trained his sight to catch the difference between a heat shimmer and real dust raised by approaching boots, the difference between the idle drift of a patrol and the pointed sweep of a search. Twice he shifted caches, a coil of wire here, a pouch of credits there, because the dunes reminded him that everything buried belongs to movement. He wore the same robe until it became a map of mended places. He took satisfaction not in acquiring, but in keeping what he had well. When he bought redundancies. 2 filters, not 1. A second strap that would wait years for its moment of necessity. Readiness was a kind of kindness, and he preferred to practice kindness in private. Owen and Beru's life unfolded like a steady prayer he never interrupted. He knew the cadence of their market days by the way the homestead lantern stayed dark a little longer after sunset. He knew when a harvest had been good, because laughter carried at supper, and when it had been hard, because the same laughter carried but ended sooner, as if saved for another meal. Once a vaporator failed in a way that could have meant a costly replacement. He spent the night below the ridge, listening to the pattern of the fault through the ground, as if the land were a drum. At dawn, he walked to a place where a spare part would eventually be found, and tucked a wrapped, refurbished valve under a set of scrap panels no one would inventory closely. A week later, the failure ended, not by miracle, but by Beru's stubborn success. He allowed himself a smile when no one could see it, and wrote in the ledger only, "A good morning." He did leave Tatooine once during those years, at Bail's call, and returned changed. The return was not an end to motion, but a settling, the way sand returns to shape a dune after a wind has cut it. The desert met him without judgment, and he met it with a deeper quiet. The disciplines he'd built to keep from burning now kept him steady without effort. He felt Qui-Gon closer at the edges, like a mirage that did not vanish when he blinked. Not a voice yet, but a presence in the quality of certain silences. On nights when the sky seemed to lower and press its cool against his brow, he would speak a thought into the stillness and feel, if not an answer, then a kindness that made answers unnecessary. The Empire's footprint on Tatooine grew in prints, and then in grooves. Checkpoints changed hands, insignia brightened and dulled, and ambition waxed and waned, with each new officer convinced that order could be imported like a machine. Ben's strategy did not change. He stayed small. He let the world's loudness flow around him like water around a stone too smooth to catch. He kept watch not only for danger, but for the subtle courage that flourishes when no one applauds. A neighbor sharing a ration unasked. A trader correcting a price down on a bad day. A Tuscan flute answered by a child's whistle from far off. Those were the notes he counted, the measures by which he judged the health of the world he guarded. When the year of too many stars ended, so did something tight in his chest. He woke one morning and realized he had slept without dreaming of fire or of masks cracked to show a friend he could not rescue. He walked his circuit and found that the horizon did not feel like a prison wall, but like a promise held open for as long as needed. He boiled water and tasted only tea. He wrote, "Luke crossed the courtyard in 3 strides today." And then, after a pause, "And I did not wish to be anyone else." The long, dry years had begun as a sentence. They became a sanctuary, and in that sanctuary a boy grew, a farm endured, and a watcher learned to become exactly the size of the hope he carried. The first hint came as a joke told too softly. In Mos Eisley, a freighter cook with hands burned smooth by steam said a new choir had passed through a port 2 systems over, all black notes and no melody. People laughed until they didn't. Tika called them the tall collectors, and the tailor, who never used words that stained cloth, called them something worse under his breath. In the cantina, a vibro lute player stopped in the middle of a song and tuned a string that was not out of tune, just to make the room lean closer while he mentioned, as if talking to the instrument, that questions had been asked about anyone who still prayed with their eyes open. The questions were always the same and always careful. Had anyone seen odd lights in the dunes? Did anyone still tell stories about nights with lamps? Did anyone notice when a frightened child quieted too quickly? Rumor tasted metallic after that, as if everyone were drinking from a cup that had been left too long against a battery dot. He listened the way a dune listens, catching what the wind carried, letting the rest pass. Patrols changed their gait. The board slouch stiffened. The idle sweep of a glance became a measure. He marked those changes the same way he marked dewback trails, not with fear, but with the understanding that a new predator had entered the ecology of the day. Inquisitors were not hunters in the way local bounty men were hunters. They were weather that believed itself a choice. They arrived where whispers converged, and they tried to cook truth out of silence. He adjusted. The force stayed small as a sip. His ledger grew plainer. The routes he took between ridge and market wandered more, though purpose guided every seeming stray. He cached 2 days of water in a place no one would think to dig. He pared his kit down until the cave's shadow could swallow it in one sweep of his arm. The saber stayed where it had stayed, and his hands grew content in other work. Tika's sandcrawler carried a new sound, a caution honk that meant a side hatch would stay closed if the wind smelled like uniforms. She told him, all casual brightness, that buyers with tidy boots had paid too much for junk that could have been had for a nod last month, which meant they were buying conversation. He traded her a story about a storm's leading edge and left with nothing but filters and 2 jokes to spend at the next stall. Because spending humor makes a man part of the furniture, and furniture survives inspections. He avoided the cantina on days when the lute player would favor slow tunes. Slow tunes make men sentimental, and sentiment makes them talk, and talk is a drum that calls the wrong dancer's dot. On the ridge, the air began to behave like it did before lightning. Even the Tuscan songs changed, a melancholy bend in phrases, a longer pause between notes, as if to listen for footsteps not meant for sand. He saw fewer family trains and more scouts, and he answered with fewer signs and more silence. When he did draw in the sand, storm warnings, a curve that meant go wide, he did it farther from routes anyone but a practiced eye would notice. He had made himself into a small figure who could slip between a raindrop and the ground. Now he learned to be the ground that lets rain pass without splash. One afternoon, a transport cut low enough over the flats that the homestead lights flickered. He felt a pressure roll out from its wake like a hand over tall grass. The instinct to push back rose in him like breath after running, and he met it with a counted 7, then another 7. When it passed, he took apart a perfectly good kettle and cleaned it until it gleamed. Pointless repair can be a prayer that keeps the mind from making trouble. That night he climbed to his east notch and watched the lane of stars that freighters favor when they are hurrying away from the truth. He addressed a single thought to the teacher who had not yet answered. I will not be baited by fear into becoming what fear is hunting. News thickened. A homestead farther north found scorch marks too neat to be raiders. A market quieted when a woman asked whether anyone had seen a child bend a toy without touching it. The woman wore simple clothes and hands that did not match, soft palms, soldier's posture. Ben lifted a crate for an old man, took longer than necessary to tie it down, and left before she finished her question. He let his shadow be traced by ordinary errands: hose, tea, one more package of screws sorted by size and wrapped in brown paper. His name passed through the inspection like air through a sieve. Ben who pays on time, Tika would chirp, and a trooper would nod, bored again, which is the safest state for the dangerous to be in. A whisper reached him from off-world, Dayu, Nur, places that smelled of neon and salt, about a man in brown with tired eyes and a girl who argued like a senator. He locked those names away without turning them into wishes. The desert made him honest enough to admit the pull, to leave, to fix, to wield proof that he still could. He answered the pull with a walk that lasted from dusk into moonrise, a long loop that took him past all 3 vantage points and back, letting the circle remind him of the vow's shape. If the galaxy had weathered itself into a season of hunting, then the boy he watched was a seed hidden in dry ground. Seeds do not ask the rain to hurry by shouting at the sky. When the Inquisitors finally brushed the edges of his world, black figures at a distance, a hush in a crowd that had learned a new definition of silence. He did not study their faces or measure their steps. He studied the people studying them, who stared, who looked down, who angled to be near the door. He memorized which merchants closed early and which lingered, because later those choices would tell him where to leave a word, a warning, a folded filter in a crate. That night he wrote only a single line in the ledger: "Wind from the east, hold fast." Then he blew out his lamp and let darkness be a place to rest, not a thing to fight. The hunt had begun in earnest, so had the art of not giving it anything to follow. The message arrived inside a broken thing that should not have spoken at all. He found the hollow projector half buried in a wash after a night of wind, its casing cracked, its lens fogged with blown grit. It had the look of something the Jawas had rejected as not worth the cage space, or something a traveler had flung aside when the weight of carrying it felt heavier than hope. He did not mean to fix it. He meant to strip the intact couplings and add them to a pouch he kept for someday. But on the ledge of his cave, with the kettle whispering and the dunes pouring their slow river past the mouth, he wiped a contacts plate with the corner of his sleeve and leaned a shard of mirror behind the emitter to coax a steadier reflection. A weak blue sigh answered him. Then, as if the dead had borrowed a breath from morning, a fragment bloomed. Not a face, not words at first, just a pulse that carried the cadence of speech through static. He adjusted nothing. He only listened. The blue cut to a shoulder, then to a blurred insignia he almost knew, then to words fighting their way through distance. Cells. Scattered. Keep the children. Old roots. If you can hear. The device died as unexpectedly as it had lived, leaving behind a silence that was a shape rather than a lackdot. He did not move for a long time. The impulse to stand, to cinch a pack, to follow whatever thread that voice had tugged into the room, flared so bright it felt like youth. In the flare, there were a dozen doors he could open, Dayu's alleys, a path rumored to stitch light between dark places, a transport lane whose star map his hands remembered without being told. He let the flare burn without feeding it. Then he blew on it as one blows on embers at the end of a long night, not to kill it, but to guide it into the smallest steady coal that could keep a heart warm without burning the house. He set the broken projector aside and poured tea. Steam rose. He watched its thin column wander and fade. Old roots, the voice had said. He had one. It ran from ridge to ridge, from dome to dune, from a boy's laugh to a woman's patient hands. He drank and said the word stay in a tone that did not feel like surrender. Later, at the edge of his east notch, he held the device again and opened it to the wind's advice. There was more memory hiding in it, like moisture in a stone at dawn, with the gentlest nudge of intent, no more than he might use to quiet a skittish Aopi. He convinced the projector to breathe once more. The same shoulder, the same half-seen emblem. Another phrase arrived out of sequence, a shard of instruction whose meaning survived its missing context. If you must hide, hide together. He smiled in spite of himself. The desert had been teaching that lesson for years. Tuskens moved as nations, Jawas as caravans, farmers by barter and obligation, even predators as pairs. Hiding together was simply living well in a place that does not forgive lone hands. He set the device down fully now, knowing the danger in making it speak again, where a patrol could pick up even the ghost of its cry. He wrapped it in cloth and slid it into a crevice in the cave wall where he kept other contradictions. A child's toy gear that turned forever, a letter strip with Baal's seal, a stone carved with a Tusken line that meant storm behind storm. That evening he wrote in the ledger to the master, who still replied only with mornings. He did not beg to leave. He did not confess a failure he had not committed. He wrote the facts. A signal broken into kindling, the scent of courage in the phrases that survived, the weight of a choice that was not new but felt newly sharpened. He asked a single question. How do I keep faith with those who fight when my fight looks like stillness? The desert took the ink and dried it without comment. He slept lightly, as if a stranger might call at the door, and he would need to be both no one and exactly who he was within the same heartbeat. At first light, a child's cry rose from the homestead and twisted into laughter when a small problem, spilled water, a stuck latch, was solved by hands that had not yet learned to turn every solution into a tale. The sound carried. It put weight on the scale where all the other weights had been set. A transmission's urgency, a galaxy's pull, the memory of light reflecting off white temple stone. The scale tipped the way it always must. He watched the boy run a line of chores in small, fierce seriousness and felt the oddest energy move through him, a kind of joy that did not require movement to feel like motion. He folded his legs and breathed until he could place that joy beside the urge to go without either spilling the other dot. He took the projector down to the ridge that afternoon and left it under an overhang where wind would bury it by degrees. Not hidden, not flaunted, set where a future seeker might find it if guided by the same coin toss of chance and care that had placed it in his hands. He marked the spot with nothing more than a feeling he would remember if ever he needed to. Then he walked the long path that touched each of his 3 vantage points in turn, the east notch, the broken column, the low lip. At the broken column he paused and pressed the heel of his hand to the stone. The rock was warm, a library of suns. There are cells, he told the day, echoing the fragment. There are roots. There are children. He almost laughed at the last word, because the truth of it needed no network and no naval charts. The child was here. In Mos Eisley. The next morning, he let the new rumor ride past him like a spice freighter loaded too heavy to stop quickly. Someone had glimpsed black armor near Anchorhead. Someone else said the collectors had questioned a mechanic about old tools. He bought nothing at the stall that day. He watched hands, not faces, and palms told him what he needed. No one was bracing for arrest, only for inconvenience. On such days, the safest place for hope is to look ordinary. He practiced being ordinary until it felt like skill rather than disguise. Back at the cave, he repaired a cracked cup and hummed a temple lullaby under his breath, not because he wanted to remember a younger self, but because lullabies are for the future, not the past. That night, when the stars came out like nails securing a tent over the sleeping world, he thought of all the tents being pitched in 1,000 places where the wind was not so kind. He knew he would leave again one day, when leaving would serve more than the ache to do something. Until then, the living hope was not a hologram you could hold at arm's length. It was a boy's laugh, a woman's patience, a man's stubborn making do. It was a watcher who wrote few words and kept them, and a desert that did not give answers but taught him where to stand, so that when the answer arrived, it would find him ready. He noticed the boy before the boy noticed the ridge. Youth moves with a speed the desert mistrusts, a lean forward that assumes the ground will rise to meet each foot. At dusk, when colors collapse into a single warm shade, a figure broke the line of a low basin and angled toward the sheltering rocks, where Ben sometimes sat to feel the day let go. The robe was wrong for Tatooine, city-cut and too clean in places, torn in others where sand had punished the cloth for not knowing better. The gate held both hunger and purpose. When the figure drew close enough for faces to carry meaning, Ben saw the telltale set of shoulders that had practiced alertness in halls with polished floors. The boy, he would always think of him as a boy, though he could have been 20, stopped as if he had run into an invisible door. Relief and fear warred across his features with such honesty that Ben felt both, like voices in a chord. "You're him," the boy breathed, and the words held salvation and accusation in equal measure. Ben did not argue the premise and did not confirm it. He tipped his chin toward a shadowed shelf out of sight from the open flats. The boy followed, stumbling once when his body remembered it had been chased. In the shared shade they crouched. Up close the signs were plain, a saber burn at the hem where a too hasty rewrap had hidden nothing. A blistering on the knuckles that comes from gripping a hilt without callus, a ritual braid cut short with something dull. The boy's voice shook with the effort of discretion. "They're here. They're asking about anyone who can still do it." He did not name the it. He didn't have to. Ben poured a mouth of water into the cap of his canteen and handed it over as if it were a simple kindness and not a sacrament. The boy drank, then drank again when Ben nodded permission. The impulse to praise the restraint and correct the haste flickered in Ben's throat, an old teacher's habit, and he set it aside. The desert teaches first, words second. "How long since you slept?" he asked, and the boy said something too brave. Ben looked at the fading light and measured the empty between patrol loops. He could walk the boy to a cut in the ridge where the night held, to a cache that would give him a few hours of borrowed breath. He could say the words that would make the boy a student for one more day. He could also summon a beacon that would steer death to this little sanctuary. "Listen," he said, and the boy did, because some tones are older than names. The way they find you is not only a trick of machines. It is hunger pushed out into the world until it drags an answer back. If you resist by throwing your own hunger at it, The two meet in the middle and make a rope. They pull. You go. Instead, you must become smaller than their question. You must make your need so modest it does not echo. The boy frowned the way people frown when advice sounds like surrender. Ben lifted a hand to forestall the argument that would waste both time and courage. "Your courage is not in doubt," he said. "Your task is to survive long enough that it matters you were brave. That means you do not light any lamps, even the ones you kept for yourself." He told the boy the names of 3 places where a person can curl into the earth and avoid the night's attention. He told him which Jawas would sell him a cracked transmitter that still hears more than it says. He told him to bury anything that had been part of a temple, not because the thing itself was evidence, but because memory makes the hand reach for it at the wrong time. He did not invite him to the cave. He did not share the ridge's exact lines. The refusal tasted like ash, and he swallowed it because ash has fed more fields than fire ever did. The boy's eyes went glassy, as if he had expected a different story. "I thought I found you," he said, and the words held that ache people carry when they have been running alone for too long and see a light and want it to be a door. "You found an old man," Ben said with a softness that tried to carry apology without opening doors that could not be closed. "And the old man found a way for you to keep moving. When he rose, he moved with him a dozen paces to set the boy's feet on the safer line, then stopped and let night swallow the distance. Watching the figure recede, he felt a twist that verged on anger, not at the boy, but at the shape of a world where the right help looked like abandonment. He returned to the cave with his hands quiet and his breath slow, and he put no entry in the ledger that night, because writing would have turned the decision into a trial, and he had already delivered the only sentence that would save a life. 2 days later, the town put on its hush. Inquisitors walked through Mos Eisley and left the air cooler behind them the way a storm steals heat. They asked for lights and for the names of people who still loved light enough to bend it. A man at a stall stared too long at his own hands when the question touched him. The vibro looter played in a key that made shoulders climb toward ears. Ben bought a strip of leather and helped a stranger tie a bundle. He measured whether anyone's gaze snagged on him and felt, with a gratitude that did not taste sweet, the relief of being forgettable. Only once did he falter, and that was when he saw the tail of a robe that had been cut wrong for Tatooine vanish into a side street. He did not follow. News of a body travels on different legs than news of a sail. 3 dawns later, he found a ridge marked by scavenger birds. At its base, the sand had been fused in a line. He buried what remained with hands steady enough to honor and cold enough to last. He said no temple words, but he did not allow the wind to do all the work. Back at the cave, he laid the saber he had not used on the stone, rested his palm on it, and told it a truth he needed to hear aloud. "Doing nothing is not the same as abandoning," he said. "Sometimes it is the only way to remain for the moment when doing something saves more than sorrow." Then he wrapped the weapon and sat in the doorway until the light turned the dunes to bronze, and somewhere far below the ridge, a child laughed at a joke only a child would dignify. He held that sound the way one holds a compass. It pointed where it had always pointed. He rose and went to walk the morning. The plea arrived in a light he had not let into his cave for years, the particular blue of an old friendship that carries the weight of duty without needing to shout its name. Bale's face flickered in the small projector like a lantern beam through rain, steady even as the image fought the journey. He spoke quickly and without ornament, as men do when time is thin and the stakes have already been counted. A child had been taken, not just any child. Leia with Padme's eyes for justice and a mouth that would teach a Senate to listen. The words touched chambers in Ben that he had bricked over on purpose. It was not only the danger that struck, it was the shape of the danger, the way it threaded through the past and called for a particular answer that only a few remaining lives could give. She was in the jaws of a machine that ate courage and spat back examples. She needed a rescuer who knew how to make a corridor long enough to carry hope from one door to another. He did not stand at once. He poured water and held the cup between his palms as if the heat could keep his thoughts from scattering. The cave was full of the life he had taught himself to live. The robe hung just so, the 2 repaired cups, the coil of wire wound to a diameter that fit a pocket, the ledger open to a page where he had written nothing yet, because the day had not announced itself until now. On the far wall, the cloth that hid the sabers had the look of a sleeping dog that would open one eye if the room changed temperature. He felt the vow to Luke arrive faithfully, as it always did when any wind touched his door. He let the vow take its seat beside Baal's call. 2 truths, both sovereign: guard the boy and answer the friend. The mind that loves certainty would demand a verdict. The heart that has learned patience asked a different question. Which action keeps both vows alive tomorrow? He walked to the cave mouth and let the desert show him what it could. The twin suns were low yet, laying long kindness across the dunes. From the ridge he could see the homestead begin its morning, the fan's cough, Beru's step, Owen's shape at the door. No alarm rose, no shadow crossed the dome. Protection, then, was not only presence, it was also the quality of the preparations he had made, the strength he had learned to recognize in the people he had promised to respect as guardians, not simply to use as cover. He tested his own fear as a craftsman tests a joint. Fear said, if you leave, you will return to ashes. Wisdom said, the world does not need you to be everywhere. It needs you to arrive at the fulcrum. He thought of the boy, whose life was still measured in chores and horizons. He thought of the girl, whose life was already measured in decisions. The scales did not balance. They aligned. He opened the cloth and held what had slept under it. The saber's weight had not changed, but his grip had. He did not take it up like a banner. He weighed it as a tool that would be asked to work rarely and precisely in service of escape rather than spectacle. He packed with the economy of a man who has learned the cost of every ounce, a plain cloak that hid more than it promised, a small kit of repairs that could turn junk into bridge or raft, a coil of cred sticks spread into 3 pockets so that losing one would mean an inconvenience, not a failure. He tucked the ledger away with a graphite stick. He might need to write in places where ink would betray him. At the last, he took the toy gear the Jawas had given him and set it back on the shelf. Hope likes to move. Let it keep turning here, unwatched, while he found the child whose hope had been caged. He did not leave a note. Notes asked to be found by the wrong eyes. He did not mark the cave with a sign only he would know, because his life had taught him that tomorrow's self does not always read yesterday's cleverness the same way. He did, however, touch 3 places in the cave that had become more than rock to him. The smooth ledge where morning prayer had cooled his breath, the small depression where his cup rested, the wall against which he had leaned the first night when grief sat beside him like a second shadow. The touch took no time and all the time it needed. Then he stepped out and let the sun make him a figure on the slope one more time, a man carrying an ordinary bag who did not look back, because looking back is a good way to become part of a story that moves in circles. Owen met him at the edge of the yard with the wariness of a man who knows how quickly peace can be sized and priced. Beru came to the doorway and did not ask a single foolish question. He said as much as could be said without naming the girl, without naming his friend, without naming the risk that would always live in the same room as their lives. He said that he would be gone for a little while, and that the roots were watched, that things set in motion would continue turning. Owen's gaze was a wall built to keep the world out. Today the wall showed a door. "We have it," Owen said, and the we held more than two people. It held land and habit and a love that preferred function to flair. Beru added only, "Come back," and in that layered simplicity Ben heard all the prayers no one would speak aloud in a world that punished people for having them dotten Mos Eisley. He walked like a man unimportant to his own story. The port's smell rose up to meet old memories. Fuel, salt, a hint of spice baked into stone. He found a freighter lane that could be bribed without becoming beholden, paid a price that would neither insult nor invite suspicion, and chose a seat that saw exits and mirrors. He did not feel younger. He felt exactly the age he was, a man who had trained his hands to be quiet for so long that lifting them into action would feel like setting a familiar tool back into its groove. As the ship lifted and Tatooine shrank to a hum under the hull, he let himself think of the child he was going to find. He pictured a small figure with a spine like a line drawn with a firm pencil, a presence that would one day braid stubbornness and mercy into leadership. He pictured, not for comfort, but for clarity, the moment when she would take his hand and refuse to be led, insisting instead that they move together. The cave darkened behind him. The ridge held his outline for a breath and then forgot it. That was as it should be. He had not broken his vow to the boy. He had made a choice that served both children, because the future does not come to a single doorstep. It spills and must be gathered by many hands. He laid his head back against the bulkhead and felt the ship shiver into its lane. Somewhere beyond, a trail waited that would demand courage from old muscles and gentleness from a heart that had practiced both in silence. He closed his eyes for the span of 5 breaths, then opened them to work. The princess would not be alone much longer. Daiyu greeted him the way a wounded city greets everyone, with too much light and not enough kindness. Neon bled along wet stone, reflections stretching into alleys where the past would gladly eat the present if given a minute. He stepped into it as a man steps into rain he cannot avoid, shoulders rounded to make the drops smaller. The noise hit first, then the smell, metal and spice and desperation sweetened to sell easier. He kept his gaze at the level of signs and shoes, where information lives. A boy hawked glowfish that looked surprised to find themselves floating in jars. A woman in a long coat moved like she had recently learned how to be tall in a room of taller men. In this place, fear did not wear uniforms. It wore need. He let the city introduce its rules. Conversations were purchases. Silence was a tax. The same face could belong to a thief at noon and to a guide by nightfall. He bought nothing but time. A man brushed his sleeve and apologized too warmly, which meant his friend was circling behind for the pocket. Ben turned with the kind of clumsiness that knocks shoulders together and makes thieves curse their luck. They faded. He mapped the exits that were not doors, The grates that had been loosened often enough to come away without tools, the drain where running water would hide footsteps for 20 paces. He felt the old parts of himself rise, the ones that liked to sort chaos into chances. He acknowledged them and kept them from leading Dot. The first lead offered itself with a swagger that wanted to be believed. A man in plain robes, voice pitched to sincerity, waved a hand near a pair of grateful clients and performed a small miracle involving doors that opened and soldiers who did not look. Ben saw the seams at once, the way a tailor recognizes a counterfeit stitch. Magnets, mirrors, a companion with the right gestures at the right junction. The con worked because it sold people a story about themselves as lucky. Ben approached him anyway, paid for a few moments of theater, and then paid again to be led to where real rumors live. The man called himself a Jedi with the pride of a thief trying on a noble's boots. Ben wanted to scold and chose mercy. In a corner where cameras had died more often than chance could explain, he let the truth show in his eyes just long enough to tell the con man what he was not and what he still could be. "Help us find a little girl," he said, and the title stripped itself from the sentence without being missed. The man swallowed, nodded, and stopped pretending magic was the reason doors sometimes opened. He found small uses for the Force that did not announce themselves. A latch unworried by a twist of thought the size of a breath. A light that flickered at the right time to make a guard choose his other shoulder for leaning. A memory inside his own muscles of how to move when the floor is slick and the crowd chooses to panic. He used it like a hand on a child's back in a busy market, guiding rather than dragging. It felt like returning to a language you only speak now to say please and thank you. The city noticed him less when he respected it in this way, as if places grant passage to those who do not try to rename them. Leia proved smaller in stature and larger in effect than the space her captors had planned for. She had disassembled half of her cell's comfort with a cleverness that promised future headaches for future guards and was cataloging insults for their return. When he stepped into the doorway, she measured him faster than any adult had done, as if she had learned early that childhood is a disguise others force on you. "Are you a good man?" she asked without irony. "I am a man who will get you home," he said, which was both humbler and truer than the answer she deserved. She did not offer her hand. She walked past him and chose the speed they would use. He matched it, grateful to remember how to keep someone in sight without crowding their shadow. Escape on Daiyu was not a straight line. It was a braid. He wove it from decoys and wrong turns and the everyday obstinacy of machines that refused to break when angered. The con man earned his second chance by being exactly as slippery for them as he had been for others, misdirecting a camera here, delivering a garbled radio phrase there. Ben lifted only when the braid snagged, letting the Force be the oil that kept ropes moving. Two patrols collided with each other's certainty and turned an alley into an argument they would be ashamed of later. A door that should have stuck opened with a sigh that sounded like luck. A child moved through the city like she had been born to ask it for favors and receive them. He kept her in the center of every choice. In a quieter stretch between districts, they paused in a courtyard where plants had been coerced into smiling under false light. Leia studied him while pretending to study a flower. "You are sad," she said, like naming weather. He let the observation pass through him without defense. "Sometimes," he said. "And you are brave," she returned. "Sometimes," he allowed. She squinted, dissatisfied with symmetry. "Then be both faster," she ordered, and sprinted toward the next gate. The instruction tightened his focus better than any mantra. He followed, feeling the odd release that comes when a purpose outside your own head sets your pace. Old wounds woke as the city tried new tricks. A corridor stank like a corridor that had once burned. A helmeted presence brushed the edge of his awareness in a way that made his ribs remember pressure and his throat remember smoke. He kept moving. The memory could not pull him backward if his attention kept finding the child's braid in a crowd, the sound of her feet on metal, the weight of her certainty that being saved did not mean being carried. He made a promise he did not speak aloud in that smell of old fire. "I will not fight ghosts while a living child is choosing to live." By the time they reached the link that would open into the next difficulty, the city had tried most of what it had. He paid with thank yous and small coins and an ability to look like a man who had never been important. Leia did not ask about his past. She asked about the next corner. "What is there?" she said, and he answered, "Something we can handle." She believed him long enough for belief to be true. When at last they climbed into a transport that would shake loose the neighborhood's grip, he allowed himself one long breath. Dayu's neon slid off the hull and fell behind like a dream you do not talk about at breakfast. The old wounds did not close. They did not need to. They had been asked to do something different tonight, to stay quiet while new work got done. He leaned his head against the metal, felt the engine's simple honesty, and prepared for the next place that would not welcome them. He had found the girl. Now he had to keep finding her until the word home was more than a promise. Water held its breath around the fortress, a dark mirror stretched to the horizon, the kind of stillness that makes sound choose its words. From the shuttle's cramped window, he saw the black geometry of the Inquisitor's stronghold rise out of the sea like a thought that refused to drown. Inside, the air felt engineered to make people feel small. He let the feeling pass through and kept only what would serve the work: the size of corridors, the cadence of guard rotations, the way lights dimmed in a heartbeat before a door decided who was welcome. Leia had been taken again, folded into a machine that mistook control for safety. He moved as a man who asked permission from no door and left no footprint a camera would care to remember. The blade stayed asleep at his belt. In its place, he used patience and old soldier tricks. A murmured nudge convinced a sensor that two figures were one. A gloved palm left on glass for a count of 5 borrowed a heat signature long enough to impersonate it. When alarms pulsed in distant halls, he knew whose courage had paid for that noise and promised himself he would match it with quiet that mattered. He found the wing where the air cooled, where long shadows suggested rooms for keeping the living and rooms for cataloging what should never have been taken from the dead. He did not look into those rooms. Mercy sometimes means refusing to make a memory you cannot carry. Leia waited at the center of a lie, sitting straighter than fear expected. He entered like a rumor that proves itself. She did not waste the moment with questions. "Do we go now?" she asked, and he gave her the only answer a child deserves. They moved together, a pace set by small shoes and a long habit of keeping others between danger and the door. When a patrol turned the wrong corner, the old language returned to his hands unasked. A flicker of light to pull eyes, a knock that came from the other side of a wall, a burst of water turned to fog to blank a lens. The fortress had been built by people who believed walls matter more than what moves between them. He reminded it that flow, not stone, decides outcomes. They reached a corridor of glass where the sea pressed close, heavy and patient. A trooper's shout began a chain the fortress had written for this very day. Alarms, locks, reinforcements, narrowing choice. He chose one the builders had not planned. With a focused cut, the blade woke and bit once, opening a seam to the ocean's waiting strength. Water shouldered in like an ally kept too long outside. He held it with both hands, not to fight it, but to give the child time to pass. When she was clear, he stepped back and let the sea finish the argument. Doors buckled, lights died. Somewhere far above, people who liked control learned what humility sounds like. They did not win by outpacing pursuit. They won by reaching a hangar where friends had turned desperation into a plan with wings. The ramp's clang underfoot was the sweetest sound he had heard in years. Even as they lifted, he felt it, a pressure rolling across the sky, familiar as a heartbeat he had once measured beside his own. Vader announced himself to the soul first. The ship shook in prop wash and in memory. Leia gripped the back of a seat and did not look away from him. "Are we safe?" she asked, with a seriousness that made lying impossible. "Not yet," he said, and in the not yet lived all their choices. Safety did not wait at the next stop. On a mining world whose air burned with old industry, night drew its own lines, and he stepped into them to buy time for a convoy full of people who thought they were ordinary until danger told them otherwise. Vader came out of the dark like the answer to a question no one should ask. The first exchange was not swords, but breath. Ben's felt too loud inside the helmet that was not a helmet, the one made of fear and memory, and he forced it quiet. Then the sabers spoke. His grip remembered, his stance remembered, but strength had been living elsewhere for a long time. The blade was heavy until purpose lifted it. He parried to live, not to prove, and lived. Fire licked the ground as troopers set the world alight to pen him in. A wall of flame rose, and in its glare, the man he once loved watched with the focus of a craftsman repairing a broken thing. By breaking it further, Pain arrived without drama. Hot and simple, when rough hands dragged him close to the coals. A friendly blast split the night and built a brief curtain of sparks. Allies who knew the value of a single minute took it and made it larger. He let himself be pulled by those who had wagered their own lives on the idea that one old fighter could still be useful tomorrow. He did not crow about escape. He did not dress the retreat as victory. He lay still and counted breaths until breath became a promise again. Somewhere beyond the roar, the child slept with her boots still on. Somewhere beneath the ache, the old oath found new wording, not to win, but to keep the thread unbroken until hands younger and steadier could tie it into something the future would trust. The map was not ink on flimsy, it was people. The path revealed itself as a chain of small rooms where ordinary courage had been teaching itself to move. A loader droid with gentle hands carried crates with the care of a midwife. A soldier with a scar that had learned to stop speaking made watch lists and tea. A former liar used his talent for pretending to make truth fit into doorways it otherwise could not pass. They did not speak like zealots, they spoke like neighbors. "Here," they said, pointing to narrow crawl spaces and to exits disguised as broken wall. "There," they said, meaning a route no chart could promise, only the willingness of one family to host another for the night. Leia walked among them as if she had found an older cousin in every room. She asked names without ceremony and remembered them with ceremony later, her small voice turning introductions into a record that would outlast the walls. Tala met him with the unadorned welcome that war cannot counterfeit. She did not ask for his legend. She asked where to put the next box and whether he could spare a minute to fix a bulky door. He watched the loader droid hold a lantern while she worked, its metal head tilted as if the light itself were a precious cargo. "Ned B," someone said, and the droid turned at the sound, patient as a tree that has seen many storms. In this place, help did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived as hands that did the next task on the list. Obi-Wan felt the strangest sensation, like finding a piece of himself that had been waiting in a drawer. He had been keeping quiet to avoid being heard. The path kept quiet so others could speak. Danger followed, as it always does when hope concentrates. Reva pressed at the doors with a hunter's certainty. Stormtroopers funneled into stone passages where echoes made bravery feel larger than it was. Obi-Wan took his place in the line not at the front as a symbol, but at the bend in the corridor where shots might slip through. He felt the old calm arrive in a different shape, not the sharpness meant for duel, but the broad steadiness meant for shepherding. He spoke to frightened families in the register that makes fear blink, then accept instructions. He mended a blaster that would never be accurate, but could be reliable for exactly 3 shots. He asked Haja to run, not because Haja was only good at running, but because sometimes the messenger must practice his one gift until it saves more than pride. The con man nodded, eyes honest for once, and vanished in the right direction. The first breach turned the safe room into a tide pool hit by a wave. Tala stood where the door would narrow a line of fire and gave them minutes that did not exist until she made them. Ned B planted itself in front of her like a wall that feels responsibility. Blaster bolts turned the air to metal taste. Obi-Wan moved the families back and kept his blade sleeping because the glow would draw the wrong story into the room. When the last choice arrived, Tala chose it with a face that had already forgiven the world for being what it was. The blast snapped the wave in half. Silence rolled in after, the heavy kind that counts the living without moving lips. Leia looked at him, and in her steady look he felt the duty to make sure Tala's minutes stretched into hours for others. He worked then with a precision that had nothing to do with spectacle. He coordinated the retreat like a mechanic aligning gears. He paired the bravest with the smallest. He took a blaster only long enough to return a shot that would stop a push without inviting a charge. He listened for the fortress in Reva's voice and heard the younger grief inside it, a shape useful to understand, not to exploit. When the time came to split the convoy, he sent Leia with a pilot who flew like a careful promise, and he stayed where failure would cost the most. "You will get home," he told the girl at the ramp. She did not ask if he would follow. She placed her small hand against his glove, as if transmitting a task. "Then keep the door open," she said, and turned away without looking back, because she had learned that trust does not always wait to see a wave dot in the dark. That followed. He felt the old blade whisper in its wrappings, a reminder rather than a demand. He answered by taking a breath that reached his heels. The path had shown him a different arithmetic, heroism measured in minutes purchased, in corridors held just long enough, in names remembered by a child who would one day say them where it mattered. He would fight, but not to prove he could. He would fight to keep the thread from breaking. The promise he carried was no longer a private vow whispered to a ridge. It was a public one spoken in a room full of ordinary people who had decided to hide together. When the doors opened again, it would be because enough hands held them. His would be one among many. That knowledge settled in him like good weight. The next choice would demand speed and mercy both. He felt ready to give each in the measure required. The moon was a spine of stone laid down in a sea of black, its ridges sharp as old promises, its valleys quiet as held breath. He stepped onto it with the calm of a craftsman preparing a familiar bench, knowing that what would be asked of him today was not strength first, but clarity. The air tasted of dust and memory. He listened to his own heartbeat until it matched the slow pulse of the place. When the ship's engine faded into the dark, he felt the other presence arrive the way a storm announces itself to trees long before the first drop falls. Vader did not approach like a man. He approached like a verdict. The ground seemed to lean toward him as if gravity itself wished to serve Dot. They circled without hurry, two figures in a landscape stripped of pretense. Obi-Wan set his feet the way he had taught 1,000 times, and for a moment a classroom flickered in his mind. Red walls, eager faces, all the small corrections that had once given him joy. Then the blade woke, hard white against the dark, and the past fell away. Vader struck with the power of a tide that does not notice rocks until it has moved them. Obi-Wan let the first storm break against a shape he had rebuilt in quiet. Not ferocity, but attention. He did not fight the man who had left him on a shore of fire years ago. He met the fighter who stood before him now, breath a machine, will a hammer, grief trapped inside armor. Their sabers signed their old names in the air, then crossed them out. Dot Stone answered every clash. Shards leapt and fell. The sound of each impact argued for rage as a teacher. He heard the argument and declined the lesson. When he needed space, he made it not by force alone, but by choosing the angle that turned pressure into glide, the way water slides off a smooth bowl. When he needed strength, he found it not in anger, but in remembering the faces whose safety had brought him to this place. He saw Leia's chin tip up against fear. He saw Luke's small hands on a toy ship at the edge of a blue sky. He let those images settle into his arms until the blade felt light again. Then he moved, and the movement carried purpose that did not shake Darth Vader pressed, and the world narrowed to the bright line between them. A rockfall cut the field into new shapes. Obi-Wan let the terrain teach him where to stand. He rose and fell with ledges, stepped through gaps as if rehearsed, turned the fight into a lesson about breath, about timing, about how a life can be carried differently when it is carried for others. A surge of power from the armored figure cracked the ground and buried him in ruin. For a moment weight pinned him, and old fear tried to speak. He refused to give it words. He listened instead for the thread of the force that never breaks, felt it winding through the stone, through his own ribs, through the years he had spent learning to be small without becoming less. He lifted not with anger, but with the very patience that had kept him hidden, and the rocks remembered how to be rocks instead of chains. Dot. He came out of the dust, changed from the inside. The blade in his hand felt like a friend returning from a long journey, with news that was not triumph, but truth. He struck then with a clarity he had been saving, cutting lines that were not about wounding, but about revealing. The armor caught the lessons and answered with fury. Sparks jumped. A final exchange opened the mask and let a face into the air that had not seen it for a long time. An eye searched him, blue and burning, and he saw the boy, the knight, the brother, each like a star at different distances. The name rose to his lips and he spoke it without demand. Anakin Dot. What came back was a refusal wrapped as release. The voice inside the armor said the thing that unknotted a grief he had been carrying like a weight sewn into his cloak. "You did not kill me. The man you knew is gone." The words fell into him like stones into a well and did not splash. He believed them, not because he wished to, but because the acceptance released them both from a fight that could never have ended otherwise. He saw then the full shape of his task. He could not save what did not want saving. He could protect what wanted to live. He lowered his blade. Mercy felt heavier and truer than victory. The face in the shattered mask flickered through anger and pain and something he could not name without breaking again. Obi-Wan bowed his head, not to the Sith, not to the past, but to the lesson that had taken a lifetime to arrive. He turned away while he still could, before the part of him that remembered every shared laugh could betray wisdom for longing. He walked back into the dark, and with each step a weight left his shoulders. Not joy, not relief, but lightness born of knowing the borders of his duty. The moon watched without judgment. Stars returned to their steady work. Behind him, the breathing machine kept its rhythm. Ahead of him waited a path not free of danger, but free of confusion about why he walked it. Stone had shown him how to stand. Light had shown him where to look. He would take both home, to the ridge, to the farm, to the small circle where hope was learning to grow. He had not won. He had learned the final measure by which he would live, and that measure would keep children safe. That was enough. He returned along the same star lanes that had carried him out, but the constellations felt rearranged. On Alderaan, he had stood in halls that smelled of cedar and fresh linen and watched a small princess reclaim her place as if it had only been set aside for polishing. He gave her the holster with a quiet smile and the warning that courage did not need a weapon to be true. She answered with a look far older than her years and a promise that sounded suspiciously like an order. Keep going. With Bail, he traded fewer words than the distance deserved. Gratitude requires less language among old friends. When the ramp closed and Alderaan dwindled to a calm star behind him, he let his hand rest on the bulkhead and felt the ship hum like a creature eager to deliver him where he belonged. He did not rehearse speeches for Owen or Beru. The desert had taught him that the right words are often short and arrive on time. Tatooine met him with its customary indifference, which he accepted as welcome. Wind sketched the dunes into their familiar patience. From the ridge he took inventory of the homestead the way he always did. The angle of the vaporator arms, the frequency of the fan's cough, the thread of smoke that meant coffee and chores, not emergency. He breathed as if filling a vessel he had used all his life and only now remembered how to hold. The quiet felt different. It was not the quiet of hiding from himself. It was the quiet after telling the truth to a man who could no longer hear it as brother. He set his pack in the cave and touched the three places he always touched: ledge, cup hollow, wall. Then went to walk the circuit with the ease of a man replacing a tool in its groove. Danger announced itself the way lightning speaks to skin before it speaks to sky. It came not from the Empire's banners, but from a singular will, sharp with purpose, moving toward the Lars homestead from an angle he had not needed to guard before. Reva's presence carried the iron scent of a wound sealed without healing. He felt it brush the edge of his attention and knew that the past had arrived wearing a shape that wanted to end cycles by continuing them. He moved quickly across the basin, not sprinting. Sprints leave trails, but with the steady haste of someone who has trained his steps to look like part of the landscape. He found the homestead braced. Owen and Beru had not waited for him. They had set the yard like a riddle a raider would answer wrong. Bottlenecks, cover points, the good pans hung as decoys, the weak ones stacked where they would fall and shout. Beru's hands were chalked. Owen's jaw was a line the desert could have used as a horizon. Without ceremony, they took their stations, and he took his, a shadow where a shadow was needed. The encounter was not a battle. It was the last tremor of an old earthquake. Reva stepped into the yard with the certainty of someone who has promised herself a kind of justice, and is ready to call it mercy. She looked like a storm that had survived the sea only to break on a single house. He watched, Blade sleeping, as she crossed a threshold none of them had wanted to draw. What happened next belonged to her more than to any of them. The way a child's face can throw a mirror into a grown heart, the way mercy can arrive disguised as failure until you look again and see it has been holding up the ceiling the whole time. When she lowered the saber, the knight breathed. He stepped from his shadow then, not as judge or savior, but as witness, and said the only sentence that mattered. You are free to choose differently now. Freedom, like thirst, must be answered in sips first. She went into the dark lighter than she had arrived, and the yard remembered how to be a yard. In the aftermath, there were no speeches. Owen's breath came hard, the way a bellows breathes after keeping a flame from dying. Beru's laugh had the tremor that follows the passing of danger and the arrival of pride. They looked at him not as at a myth restored to function, but as at a neighbor late to a task that had already been done well. He did not pretend otherwise. He thanked them with few words, and a look meant to carry all the long hours when thanks would have been too large for the room. He's safe, Owen said, which was both report and command. He is, Ben answered, and meant more than the child asleep in a corner room. He meant the net they had woven together without ever admitting they were weaving. Sleep that night came quick and kind. In the cave, the saber settled under its cloth with a contentment that mirrored his own. Dawn found him on the ridge, the valley below rinsed clean by first light. He felt the after-image of the duel like a distant bruise and let it inform, not inflame. His watch resumed, but its tenor had changed. The work ahead would still be pebbles and knots, cups cooled and storms split. It would also be lighter by the weight he had put down on the stone moon. He moved through the day with a quiet that did not strain, speaking to the Aopi, tuning the fan that had learned to cough in a key he could now correct without thinking, leaving a filter where Beru would find it and believe it the victory of her own tidy habits. Near evening, he walked to the farm's edge, where fence gave way to wild. Owen stood there as if measuring how much land a man can hold in his hands. Ben stopped where the dirt turned from tended to ordinary, and did not step across. "Thank you," he said. The words were smaller than what they needed to carry, but they carried it anyway. Owen's nod was a kind of handshake older than treaty. Beru appeared at the door with 2 cups and raised one in a salute that made the moment correct itself into ease. No ceremony, no binding, just the simple acceptance that all 3 of them were equal to the task, each in their place. On his way back to the cave, the air changed, warmer in a way that had nothing to do with weather, familiar in a way that made the hair at his neck lift not from fear but from recognition. He paused, half smiling at nothing visible, the way a person smiles when a word they have been looking for finally walks into the room. Not yet, the world seemed to say, but soon. He took the hint and kept walking. Home had returned around him, but he had not returned to the same home. The ridge looked like it always had. The man on it did not. He set the cup in its hollow, wrote a single line, "The door held," and blew out the lamp. Outside, the desert kept its watch. Inside, he kept his. Both felt for once exactly enough. Morning measured itself in simple chores and in a quiet that felt earned. He rose before the heat and walked the ridge not to inspect it for danger, but to greet it like a neighbor, noting where wind had combed the dunes into new ribs, where a beetle had stitched a small story across the sand. The desert taught patience by giving answers at the pace of stones. If he waited, shade would move to him. If he hurried, he would waste water and attention both. He learned to time his steps with Iopi's breath, to rest in narrow bands of shadow that only appeared for a handful of minutes, to set his canteen in a shallow scrape where the sand stayed cooler than the air. The Force met him in these small obediences, not as a trumpet but as a pulse underneath everything. He stopped asking it to carry weight he could set down with his own hands. He used it to cool a cup, to still a spooked animal, to nudge a loose rock into a safer place before anyone's ankle found it. In practicing gentleness, he found strength that did not need to announce itself. He kept a habit of repair as others keep prayer. A frayed strap became whole with time and thread. A cracked bowl served another season because he respected its fault line and mended along it instead of across it. The cave grew tidy in the way of workshops rather than shrines, shelves holding just enough. The ledge swept clean, the kettle cleaned of the bitterness that comes when metal is ignored. In town he bartered without drama, returned tools when promised, listened more than he spoke. When a child cried at a stall because a toy no longer whirred, he bought nothing and said nothing, only turned aside later to set a salvaged spring where small hands would find it by chance. He preferred kindness that left no trail. The Tuscans passed more often in single lines as the seasons rolled. He did not intrude. Sometimes a sign appeared near his route, a curve of marks he had learned to read as a warning about wind. He answered with a mark of his own farther off, a sketch that said the water table was closer at a certain bend of rock. These exchanges did not make a friendship. They made something humbler and steadier. He learned to keep silence as a gift, not as a disguise. When their flutes carried at twilight, he listened from his cave mouth and let the notes teach him where to set his breathing. Music and the Force seemed related on such nights, each a way to be present without having to take the room. He practiced a discipline of not rescuing too soon. A moisture farmer swore at a stuck valve and then, with patience and a better grip, solved it alone. Ben stood on the ridge and held his hand still. Another day, a dewback strayed near a brittle edge. He did not yank with power. He sent a feeling like cool water into the animal's ribs, and the creature turned with a snort, convinced by its own good sense. A merchant in Mos Eisley told a lie that could have become a fight. Ben stepped closer so that his quiet face was suddenly part of the bargaining, and the lie lost interest. He learned that presence itself can be a tool, and that many emergencies dissolve when no one is adding heat. At dusk, he sat and let the land finish speaking. The ledger filled with small sentences. Today the fan sang in a better key. Today I walked at half speed and saw twice as much. Today a child's kite climbed past the dome and came down laughing. He wrote to the master he could now almost hear, and the replies arrived as a change in the air, as if approval could be a temperature. Once, on a morning clear enough to see the far ridge like a thought you finally grasp, the shimmer at the edge of his sight gathered itself into a shape. He did not reach for it. He smiled and bowed his head. The desert had been preparing his eyes. The lesson was simple. When you make enough room, old friends find their way back. Seasons folded into each other without losing their edges. The year of generous winds left sand in every seam, but also brought cool nights and easy sleep. The year of deep wells kept the homestead's fans purring. He matched his habits to these rhythms, mending more in hot months, walking wider when the sky allowed, keeping closer to home when rumors grew sharp. He did not curse the Empire under his breath. He did not rehearse quarrels with the past. He placed his energy where it would add to the pile that kept the door open, a replacement filter left where Beru would find it and believe it her own good planning. A warning murmured to Tika in the language of prices, a sign scratched on stone high enough that only a watchful eye would note it. When sleep came, it came like a partner. He lay down with the saber wrapped and far from reach, and woke to first light with the ordinary pleasure of knowing exactly what the day required. He had become small on purpose and found the paradox that the smallest lives can hold the widest skies. The desert had taught him not to master it, but to belong to it. In belonging, he discovered the shape of peace that does not depend on winning. Tomorrow would bring work much like today's, measured in quiet successes no one would count. He welcomed that measurement. It meant the children were still getting older, and the world still had mornings worth guarding. At first it was only a change in the air, the way silence sometimes deepens just before dawn, as if the world has taken one last careful breath. Then the shimmer he had been glimpsing at the edge of sight gathered itself the way heat gathers on a far road, and from that brightness a figure stepped, not heavy enough to disturb dust, real enough that the heart recognized him before the eyes finished their work. "Master," Obi-Wan said, because that was the name the body knew, and the reply came like water finding the path it had always meant to travel. Obi-Wan. The sound held warmth and amusement, and a patience large enough to sit down beside any sorrow without rushing it away. He did not reach for the figure. He let the figure come to him, and when the light that shaped it settled on the cave's ledge, the cave felt like a temple remade from ordinary stone. Qui-Gon did not deliver instructions the way a general delivers orders. He arrived like a listening made visible. "You have learned to be quiet," the old voice said. "Now learn why." The lessons that followed did not ask for a blade or a leap. They asked for surrender that did not feel like loss. In the mornings they walked the ridge together without leaving two sets of tracks. Qui-Gon taught him how to let attention widen until a beetle's small pilgrimage and the far thrum of a sandcrawler and the steady breath of a sleeping child all lived in the same room of awareness. "The Force is not what you lift," he said once, looking toward the homestead with affection that did not intrude. "It is what you allow to move through you without insisting on your shape." In the heat hours they sat where a narrow shade cut the glare into softer pieces, and the talk turned to fear. Not the fear of enemies, which is simple, but the fear that wears the mask of responsibility. "You protected the boy by becoming small," Qui-Gon said. "Do not make a new prison out of that size. To be small on purpose is a freedom. To be small from fear is a chain." Obi-Wan felt the truth of it loosen an old knot behind his ribs. He had learned not to intervene. Now he learned when to step fully into a moment and let the Force carry weight again, briefly, precisely, without turning help into spectacle. At dusk they practiced joy, which had become the most neglected of disciplines. Qui-Gon would tilt his head at a lopsided repair and say, "Good," in a way that made good mean complete rather than perfect. He would laugh when the EOP stole a date from a pouch and call it robbery, and Obi-Wan would find himself laughing too. the sound unfamiliar and then not. They spoke of Anakin only when the talk came like weather, not by summons. There was no condemnation, no praise misplaced as comfort, only a shared knowledge of the line between what can be guarded and what must be released. "You did not fail him by walking away," Qui-Gon said once, as stars began their quiet work. "You succeeded by knowing where your hands could still save." Nights carried longer journeys, the kind a body takes while appearing to sleep. Qui-Gon showed him paths where thought loosens and the self becomes as thin and bright as a strand of light, anchored to love rather than to name. In those passages, Obi-Wan met no counsels and no trials, only the gentle instruction to trust that dissolving does not mean dying. "When the time comes," the Master said, "you will step through the door you have been building all along, one small kindness at a time." The ledger changed in those days. Fewer words, clearer words. Today the wind was enough. Today I listened first, and it made the second thing easier. Today I practiced leaving without absence. He found that leaving could mean stepping a little farther back from a solved problem so that others could feel their strength. He found that presence could be a warmth in a room he had already exited. He found that love does not always stand guard at a door. Sometimes it trusts the house it helped build. On a morning rinsed to a pale brightness, they stood above the farm and watched a boy race a toy ship along a fence and nearly trip with triumph. "You see," Qui-Gon said, and the two words held a decade of instruction. Obi-Wan did see. He saw that the future did not need him to be large, only to be exactly where he was with nothing clenched. He bowed his head in thanks that had no endpoints, and when he raised it, the figure was gone in the way light goes when you step out of a shadow, not erased, only everywhere. The voice remained, not as a sound, but as a habit of peace that met him each morning at the cup, at the ridge, at the cave mouth where the world began. The morning he chose to speak a word aloud, the sky had rinsed itself into the impossible blue that comes after a windstorm, has carried every speck of dust toward someone else's horizon. From the ridge, the homestead's domes looked newly carved, edges crisp, shadows polite. He walked the circuit as he always did, counting the chores without needing to see them, and felt the quiet settle not as a duty, but as a gift. At the east notch, he paused and listened for the small differences that tell a watcher the day will turn. A laugh came clear enough to place, the boy outside, practicing being faster than his feet. Obi-Wan stood until he could feel the shape of that joy as if it were sunlight on his shoulders. Then he angled down the slope, not toward the door, but toward the fence where tended ground becomes wild dot. Owen waited there as if measurements were being taken that required a sturdy jaw. He did not pretend surprise, did not perform hospitality or rejection. He touched the brim of his hat like a man acknowledging weather. They stood with a couple of arm spans of air between them, the distance that lets words be exchanged without making them heavy. "We've had a run of good water," Owen said, which meant, "You can speak without breaking anything." "Your lines look clean," Obi-Wan answered, which meant, "I will say what I have, and then I will go." Beru watched from the door with a cup in her hand and a look that could have been read as gentle warning or gentle blessing, depending on what followed. It felt like a ceremony designed by people who do not like ceremonies. "I owe you thanks," he said, and Owen's mouth tightened at the corners as if to argue that debts are dangerous near a farm. "Not for letting me stand watch," Obi-Wan continued, "but for being a wall I did not have to lean on." Owen's eyes flicked toward the yard, where a blur of motion resolved into a boy and a battered toy racing each other along a row of posts. "We've done our part," he said, which in Owen's tongue is a simple sentence that can carry a lifetime of labor without showing strain. Obi-Wan nodded, accepting the scale and the pride inside it. He did not ask permission for what he wanted next. He asked a question that made permission possible. "May I say hello?" Beru's chin rose half an inch. She set the cup down and walked a few steps into the yard, not to escort or to watch, but to place herself at the right hinge, the one that keeps a door honest. Owen studied the sand between his boots as if the answer might be written there in small, stubborn script. When he looked up, his face was the face of a father who has decided that keeping a promise includes the parts no one warned him about. He gave a short nod toward the boy, a nod that contained more conditions than grammar can carry, and more trust than words can repay. The message was clear. One greeting, measured, nothing asked in return but the decency to keep it simple. Obi-Wan inclined his head, grateful to be given a rule, grateful to feel how right rules can be when they protect a child. Luke skidded to a stop without falling, which is a victory worth celebrating at any age, and looked at the stranger as if assessing a rock he had seen on the horizon for years, but never decided to climb. The toy in his hands was the kind Jawas sell by the basket: 2 wings, a nose, a stubborn reluctance to fly without being thrown. "That's a good ship," Obi-Wan said, offering a truth instead of a compliment. Luke considered the statement and lifted the toy to eye level, as if to check. "It rolls when it crashes," he announced, which meant he had already learned to make luck out of failure. Obi-Wan smiled, feeling the softness that comes when a child sets the terms of the conversation. Those are the best kind. You get to try again. He kept his hands at his sides. He did not crouch, did not turn the moment into a lesson, did not insert old stories into a morning that belonged to new ones. "Hello?" he said, and discovered that a single word can carry more care than 100 plans. Luke nodded, as if filing the voice away in the place where useful things are stored. He jogged a small circle and asked, "Do you know how to make it go farther?" Because pragmatic curiosity had already taken hold in him the way good soil takes hold of rain. Obi-Wan glanced at Owen, received the faintest permission to add a half-inch to the boy's world, and offered one sentence. "Throw with your eyes first, then your hand." Luke tried it, squinting at a point beyond his aim, and the ship skimmed a little more of the blue before tumbling to a happy stop. His laugh, when it came, seemed to lift the fence line by a finger's width. Beru's chuckle drifted across the yard, the warm punctuation that tells a scene it may end without regret. Obi-Wan took the cue. "Good morning," he said, making the phrase do double work as greeting and farewell. "Good morning," Luke returned, already chasing the ship to throw it again, already forgetting the stranger in the way healthy children do when the day offers a better game. Owen's nod became a small salute. Beru lifted her cup. Obi-Wan stepped back to the fence line and did not step over. The desert's edge welcomed him home like a familiar threshold dot. On the ridge again, he sat with the knowledge that a door had opened exactly as wide as it should. The Force moved through him without argument, unburdened by longing or by the itch to edit the future. He pictured the boy's eyes aiming beyond his hand and felt an answering adjustment in his own chest, some internal sight relearning where to look. He wrote only one line in the ledger before blowing out the lamp that night. Hello was enough. The blue sky outside held its breath for the stars, and then exhaled them, clear and bright and numerous as permission. He slept easily. In the morning, the ship would fly a little farther. That was the entire point. He built the last years like a small house with many windows, each task a pane kept clean so light could find its way through. Morning began with the simple liturgy of water, flame, and tea. The cup warmed by his palms before it cooled under a gentle touch of the Force. He walked the ridge not to discover danger, but to confirm the absence of it, counting fans, listening for the honest cough of machinery, letting the eye rest on the rectangle of the homestead and the narrow ribbon of sky above it that changed color as faithfully as a bell keeps time. He traded in town with the confidence of a man who has earned the right to be mistaken for furniture. Filters, hose, a packet of screws, a spool of wire. Useful things that promise nothing and deliver exactly what they are. When Tika teased that he had become dull, he grinned and paid for the insult with a story about wind. Dullness, in a world like this, is a sturdy armor dot. He paired possessions until the cave held only what a good day requires, and a bad day cannot begrudge. A cloak that shed heat and pride equally. 2 bowls mended more times than most friendships. The ledger that had thinned to a handful of clear entries. Weather, laughter, a task completed without anyone noticing it had needed doing. The saber slept deep now, wrapped in a pouch with another beside it, both buried where even his thoughts seldom went. He touched the stones over that place once a month, as if to confirm that readiness could be real without being near. He dreamed of the blades less often and of water more. Rain that fell like permission, rivers that remembered his feet. Dreams did not rehearse battles. They practiced walking away from them. He accepted being known in small ways by people who never learned his story. The tailor set aside a roll of cloth that wore like shade and saved him the best thread for mending. The cantina player switched keys when Ben entered, favoring songs that keep a room from sharpening. A child who had once cried over a broken toy now haggled for parts with wide competence, nodding respectfully to the quiet man whose repairs always held. Inquiries from the Empire passed through town like storms that arrived late to their own speeches. He moved his steps a degree to the left, a degree to the right, never enough to look like avoidance, always enough to satisfy boredom. Information kept coming from the Jawas like a tide made of gossip and screws. A rumor softened here, a name varnished into anonymity there. He contributed by telling the truth about weather. The desert taught a last handful of lessons and repeated a few worth hearing twice. Slowness can be speed when the ground is unkind. Silence can be speech when the room is crowded. Mercy begins before anyone deserves it. He learned to see the distance between no and not now, and to stand in that narrow place with patience. When a Tuscan sign warned of a hunt crossing the old basin, he answered with a mark farther along that bent the route a few degrees away from the homestead. When Anchorhead's market threatened to turn mean under a new foreman's greed, he stood near the scales on a busy day and let the sight of his steady face become part of the arithmetic. Prices settled, later stories said, because the weight was wrong. Though no one could say how they knew, he practiced debtless kindness because it leaves less shadow. An extra filter folded among Baru's purchases without note. A hinge tightened on a gate that squeaked only at night, so its alarm belonged to the people who needed it, not to every ear on the salt flats. He steered a lost dewback home by walking ahead of it without looking back, letting the animal believe it found its own good sense. The saber remained a last word he never spoke. He preferred to win arguments between wind and flame with buckets and thought. Luke grew into his outline the way a star grows into a name on a chart. The boy's questions sharpened. The horizon he aimed for moved out with him. Obi-Wan kept the greeting they had established, a hello, when paths crossed by arrangement or luck, and respected the space it created. He watched a figure run along the fence line and saw that speed had turned into rhythm, that the laugh had found a lower register, that confidence had traded some of its shine for grip. These were the measurements that mattered. He did not collect them as trophies. He stacked them like bricks in a wall that would hold when history leaned too hard. Sometimes, at dusk, he and Qui-Gon spoke without words about leaving. Not the impatient leaving of a man who wants to change scenery, but the leaving that arrives when the work inside a room is complete. And the hallway calls. The voice in the quiet asked only that he remain teachable. He learned to pack in his head what to carry when the door opens, what to leave so the room stays blessed. A coil of line, a truth simple enough to guide a frightened child. A memory that warms without burning. Seasons took their turns with an almost ceremonial decency. The year of cool nights made the ridge generous. The year of stubborn fans made ingenuity fashionable again. He let himself be proud of small craftsman victories. A kettle that no longer sang in the wrong key, a seam sealed so cleanly that only fingers could find it. Pride, in the right dose, keeps hands keen. On a morning bright enough to make even old stone seem new, he straightened the cave with the affection a man feels for a room that has taught him. He set the cup in its hollow and smoothed the blanket as if for a guest who might arrive while he was out. When he walked the ridge that day, the air tasted like arrivals. Not danger, not yet. Only the sense a place has when a story is about to ask for it. He stood where he could see the homestead and the long road and the piece of sky that ships prefer when they are honest. A feeling moved through him that was not command and not warning. It was invitation. He did not stiffen against it. He let it pass into him and out again until he could tell its shape. Then he smiled, not with triumph, not with relief, but with recognition. The life he had made, scaled to hope, edged to service, tuned to quiet, was ready to be picked up and carried into whatever hallway waited beyond the door. He would go when called because staying had taught him how. Back in the cave, he wrote one line and left space beneath it for the next hand to continue if that hand ever needed to. Everything that mattered fit. He blew out the lamp and sat in the soft remainder of light. Outside, the wind braided the dunes into tomorrow's maps. Inside, a man who had once been loud learned again how to listen. When the knock came, soon, not yet, but soon, he would answer with a room swept, a heart unburdened, and a word that had kept children safe for years without announcing itself. Yes. The evening arrived with the sort of gentleness that makes even old stone seem considerate, and he felt it before he saw it. The soft tilt of the world that says a path is about to step out of the mirage and become a road underfoot. The ridge wore its usual colors, the farm kept its faithful rhythm, and the sky's blue had already given itself to the first star without complaint. He straightened the cave the way a man thanks a room that has taught him, smoothed the blanket, rinsed the cup, pressed a palm to the wall where his first night's shadow had once sat heavy. The saber slept where it should, deeper than habit, lighter than fear. He walked to the lip of stone and stood with the patience of someone who has learned to tell invitation from alarm. The air tasted like arrivals. Down in the basin, the faintest lights stitched themselves across sand. A search not yet desperate, footsteps not yet sure of their story. He did not tense. He inclined, the way a tree leans into a wind it knows by name. Qui-Gon's presence warmed the space that wasn't quite silence. Not words now, only a steady yes. He thought of all the years he had measured with pebbles and knots, of cups cooled and storms bent, of children's laughter catalogued alongside weather, of the way leaving can be another shape of staying when done for the right door. The desert had taught him to belong, the path had taught him to share, the duels had taught him where to stop, and the families had taught him that a single greeting can carry a houseful of care. He smiled, not because the story had become simple, but because he had. A shape moved along the lower ridge. A small figure hurried by the kind of worry that arises only when something precious has gone missing, and beyond it, the twinned glimmer of fate's most unlikely escorts. The threads gathered without fanfare, descendant, weaving themselves into an opening the size of a sentence. He did not rehearse it. He let the words arrive as they had waited to, washed clean by years of discipline into kindness, a bridge between a past that had learned to forgive itself and a future that was ready to grow. He stepped where the ground makes introductions, cloak quiet, hands open, and the man who had once shouted across the stars offered instead the smallest gift a guardian can give at the beginning of a new chapter. A greeting sized for hope, sized for a boy under a blue sky, sized for the door that was finally ready to swing wide. "Hello there," he said, and the syllables landed like water on warm dust, turning the moment into a road that led away from hiding and into the work he had been building toward with every patient breath. The ridge kept his outline for a heartbeat and then released it. Behind him, the cave held its peace. Before him, the day made room. The lamp inside his chest did not flare. It glowed, steady as a homestead lantern at dusk, an old knight's answer to a galaxy that still needed small lights more than it needed thunder. He followed where the greeting invited, ready to be exactly the size of the hope that had brought him here.